Hi, everybody. Andrew Smith here with you. Now, it's going to be a really fun semester, and we're talking a lot about social media. And all through the semester, we're going to have a lot of great guests. And joining me for this segment is Scott Kraft. Scott Kraft is the Deputy Managing Editor of the Los Angeles Times. And Scott, we appreciate you being with us here in class.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
Now, tell us a little bit about your road to the LA Times and kind of what your background is before we start talking about the social media aspects of everything.
Well, I went to Kansas State. I was in high school. Went to Wichita West High School and edited the paper there, and was editor of the Collegian here at Kansas State. And then I did a bunch of internships, like a lot of people do, and went to the AP at first, and worked for the AP in Jefferson City, Kansas City, Wichita, and finally New York. And from there, I got a job at the LA Times as a national correspondent.
So now that you're out there on the LA Times, how have you seen media change, and particularly in the social media realm, as we're talking a lot about the social media and the things that have been going on in the last 15 years or so? It's a very different climate now than it was.
Oh, it's a very different climate. It's, sometimes it's only when I think back to what it was like to be a foreign correspondent back in the day that I realize how much it's changed, and overwhelmingly for the good. For one thing, in the last 15 years, journalists have a lot better tools than they ever had. And it seems obvious, but the fact that you can communicate and the office can reach you anywhere you are, which is a plus and a minus, I guess. But you can do that. You can create all kinds of content, as it were, all kinds of journalism in all kinds of ways with your phone, and with really a minimum size kit, which we used to call, what do you take? What do you take to a story like when you're covering a war in Somalia? What do you take? The kit's tiny now. So that makes it much easier. So it's much easier to gather news. And I think there are many more opportunities because of all the platforms, many more opportunities for different kinds of storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit about the transition that newspapers in particular went moving into the online venue. Some would say that they were a little hesitant to get into the digital venue, and maybe were a little bit late in getting into it when they finally did. How did you see that transition when you were living through it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's true that we were not a little bit hesitant, we were a lot hesitant, and we were very slow. Newspapers generally, I'm speaking about. I mean, partly because of the business model was such that the print product was producing all the revenue, and the revenue was not as obvious on the digital side. And it didn't grow as fast as we kind of thought it would for many of us. So I think there's that. So that's the business element. But then there's the journalistic element too. And I guess as happens in any newsroom where you have the grizzled old veterans and then you have new people coming in, there was more. It's always been the case that there was a gap there, but the gap really grew starting about 15 years ago. And I think where we've come over this 15 years, slowly but steadily, the folks who were more experienced, older, more experienced, and just didn't really have the passion to change, or really the kind of inclination to change, moved on. They do other things now, if they're still working. And really it's become a much more exciting and younger newsroom as a result of all these changes. Now, one thing that we always have to watch out for, and we have to really, as a manager of a place like that, I have to, especially when hiring people, need to look for skills that are broader. People coming out of journalism schools today have a lot of the social media, a lot of the kind of multi-platform skills, the technical side, and they're not quite as good often on the nuts and bolts, bread and butter stuff that was all we learned before. So it's a lot to come out with. But we find that, I think, reporters, the star reporter who's in his or her 20s or 30s today can do all those things, is a great writer, really understands social media and lives in that world, understands our audience and how to reach them.
you say that it's kind of swung one side. Now trying to swing that back the other way. How did the advent of social media then, after moving to a digital platform, really the rise of social media in the last 10 years, let's say, has really also changed the way you cover a story? How has that made the way that you cover it, deadlines, the quotes and the sound bites and the little digibytes and the 140 character stories that have had to now become de rigueur for what you're doing?
It's been a little bit of a rocky transition, I think, because I think the social media component of what we do in journalism is it's very specialized in a way, and it's really been the hardest thing for traditional content providers, meaning kind of writers, still photographers, things like that, to kind of get. But we seem to be really making a lot of progress, and I think the exciting thing about it is that we're all in the business of trying to do great stories that get read. And we know that social media is really is the most important thing to finding audience. The other thing is that social media is often not used as much as it should be, and we're still trying to figure out how to do this, but to use it as a news gathering device itself, to put out the call for DACA, for example, when Trump decided to get rid of DACA and then they didn't, and anyway, back and forth. But it's nice to be able to just sort of have a call out. Tell us your story. Mm-hmm. And those create stories themselves, which are, of course, widely shared.
Mm-hmm. So part of the social media revolution has been the connection with the audience.
Yeah.
So now you're able to connect with the consumer much better than before, whereas maybe you had to walk down to the newsstand as he was picking the paper out of there, or you're really making a lot of beat calls. There's now a back and forth. What kind of relationship do you see between, in particular for the LA Times, the writers, and the consumer, and the interaction that happens? Kind of a give and take, as well as not just finding stories, but also developing.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, we really do need to work on that and figure out how to do that in the best way, but also in a way that will produce news that really is valuable to a broader audience. Because of the advent of social media and digital media generally, pretty much anybody can be a publisher. Anybody can be a writer. And so where traditional news organizations like ours need to succeed is to be the place where readers know they can come to find kind of an authoritative news you can trust, especially in the era of so-called fake news. It's really important to be a trustworthy source. So when we have call-outs to the audience and hear their stories, we also have to still go through the same hoops that we always had to go through: verify who these people are, whether we use their full names or not, but verify who they are, that not allow them to use the same standards we use for letters to the editor and other things, not allow them to deliver personal attacks under the cloak of anonymity, and all those sorts of things. So there is a little bit of it's not that you can just turn on the spigot and put it on our Facebook account.
Now, and that which is important. How important are those checks and balances? I mean, you mentioned anybody can be a publisher. What does that do journalistically to muddy the waters for the consumer?
Well, I think, yeah, it does. It's very difficult to be a consumer of news today and to figure out what you can trust. And of course, it all is. That's overlaid on this what's happening in the country, the increasing polarization. People are in their own silos, listening to the news that supports what they believe. So that's a real challenge, actually, for the LA Times and every news organization like this, which is trying to really bridge that gap and try to be middle of the road, or not exactly middle of the road, but to present all points of view. Mm-hmm. And so it's a challenge. I don't think we've really quite figured it out, how to do it well. But for a reader out there, I think if I, as a reader myself, I look for the tried and trusted brands that I know have delivered solid news you can believe in the past, and that group of organizations is growing. I mean, it includes places like BuzzFeed and and many publications that are only online.
Mm-hmm. As you now look toward the future of news, do you see it getting even more interactive between the consumer and the provider?
Oh, I think yes, totally. It'll get much more interactive. It'll be, I mean, we are heading toward a situation where print will disappear. I mean, not tomorrow, not in 5 years, but it's headed out because that's just not how people consume news. And I think as more people consume news through digital sources and through Facebook and their mobile devices, I think we're going to inevitably have an even closer relationship with our readers, and they'll be heard more when they speak to us. I mean, you alluded to this earlier, and it's so true. When we had a print paper, the LA Times had 1 million plus circulation, but we didn't know who those readers were. We did surveys, and we really weren't sure, and you didn't know how many readers would read which story. Now, of course, our access to data, that kind of data, is amazing. And I mean, places like Chartbeat and other things that's kind of a crude tool. There are even much more detailed tools. I get a report every day where I can see what the top story was, where all the traffic came from. I mean, you can really figure out what kind of stories are working. And one interesting thing I find in looking at these daily reports and weekly reports is that it's very heartening, actually. The top stories of the day are not really what we used to call clickbait stories. Mm-hmm. You don't have to write about Justin Bieber to have a really top a story with a ton of audience.
Cats. I want cats.
Cats.
That's
Exactly.
Mostly cats.
Exactly. I mean, and so that's actually very heartening. I mean, really serious stories, and not always the ones we expected, but serious stories do very well for us and are among our top 10 stories of the year. Usually are stories that have taken us months to do, in fact. So enterprise, investigative, those kind of stories that make us stand out from the pack, are really where we've got to head.
And there still is a place for long-form journalism. It's not all 140 characters.
Yep.
It's still, why is that so important to make sure you keep that focus, as opposed to just jumping into feeding the consumer as much as you can possibly feed them in one funnel?
Right. Actually, that's a great question, because you wouldn't think that it'd be worth it. But two things going on. One, it's our duty as journalistic enterprises is really to hold the powerful accountable. But also, it's actually good business, because we want to set ourselves apart from everybody else out there. And there's a lot of discussion these days of commodity news, which is basically what we're referring to is news that everybody's doing. You can get it anywhere. If there's an election in London, you can get that from a ton of different sources. And so we are asking ourselves hourly, if not by the minute, what can we add to that story? So when it comes to investigative reporting or long-form narrative, that is a place where we can really make a difference. It's hugely expensive because some of our investigative stories have taken months, some have taken several years, and same with narrative stories. But I think we have a real opportunity there, because we can set ourselves apart. We can be something that a reader will realize, oh, the LA Times brings me this kind of work. If we do it enough, then they may say, well, I'd like to be a digital subscriber. So that's, I think, the future.
Scott Kraft, Deputy Managing Editor of the LA Times. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
JMC alum. Thanks very much.
Nice to be here. Thank you.